Good morning and welcome back to the current affair lectures that we have been doing for last 1.5 years, and I hope these lectures are helping you a lot. So for this week we have taken a lot of important topics, 5 important topics on my side. Basically, two are importantly related with environment and one with polity, I believe. But we'll be getting into the depth of all these topics. Before that, I would like to inform you that the kind of current affairs that we have been doing here are those current affairs that are like that need us to go into the depth of the topic. Okay. And I, on my part, I am having this assumption that you are going through the current affairs and I will be bringing it, decoding it, those topics which are not only important, are difficult to understand, have a multi-dimensional nature, and one when in a topic when one needs to understand some kind of background as well. Okay, so let's begin the lecture. The first topic that we are having today: India updates. Sorry. Okay. India updates its climate pledge to Paris Agreement. Now, Paris Agreement, of course, Paris is the capital of France. Paris Agreement was signed in 2016 under the Conference of Parties 21. That means it was a conference of the parties to what? When we say Conference of Parties, COP21. ठीक है, तो Paris Agreement, okay, Paris Agreement was signed in 2016 between the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, when we talk about the parties, what does that mean? Parties means the countries, organizations, civil societies, if there are, okay, usually it usually means countries, right? But in this case, in this specific case, it will mean countries only, okay, because only countries are party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, what is this UNFCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? It was it is a kind of global governance related to environment, right? Like there are so many countries in the world. Every country has its own priority. Every country has its own level of development in it, right? But all the countries, despite having different capabilities, different responsibility, different abilities, different level of development. Some countries are developing, some countries are developed. All the countries have one common problem, and that is climate change, right? That problem is climate change. So what these countries need to do? These countries need to arrive at a consensus-based model or a system of governance where these countries can implement such protocols and such laws which will help them in making this environment climate change, like in combating this climate change through adaptation and mitigation. Whenever we talk about climate change, two things we need to remember. The first one is adaptation, the second one is mitigation, right? So UNFCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was this convention was agreed to in 1992 in the Rio Earth Summit. Rio de Janeiro is in Brazil. This conference, this United Nations Framework Convention. Now, I would like to make these things very clear in the very beginning so that you do not carry your doubts any further. Okay? So, there are two things. COP, that means conference. Okay? Conference of parties, okay, and the second one is UNFCC, United Nations Framework Convention. This is framework convention. Okay. Now the upper one is conference. Conference is a kind of meet, like countries meet annually and they decide the future course of action for a year or two. Now what is UNFCCC? It is a framework convention. Framework convention means a convention or a set of guidelines which decide what kind of environmental challenges we are facing, what kind of environmental issues that we are facing right now, and what kind of governance model, basically what kind of governance model. Okay, this is very important. What kind of governance model we need to have, right? So I hope you understood the difference between UNFCCC and COP. Now UNFCCC was negotiated in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. Understood? Now under the United Nations Framework Convention, there are a lot of countries, at least around 196 countries are party to this. That means they have signed this convention and they have agreed to follow the rules that are being laid down, and they are obliged to follow the governance model that they have arrived at under the UNFCCC. Now India is also party to that, and all these parties meet every year. They meet every year to stock take as to what is going on. As to what is going on and how have they performed on the parameters of countering the climate change. Okay, and in one such conference, COP21, in 2016, COP21 was held in Paris. Under that conference, countries agreed on a new climate deal that is called Paris Climate Deal. Okay, that is called Paris Climate Deal. So under that climate deal, what that climate deal talks about is a specific governance model for all the countries to follow to counter the climate change or to adapt to the climate change and mitigate its effects. Okay, now why this is in news? Because India has updated NDC will be communicated to UNFCCC Center to High Court. One petitioner filed a petition in Delhi High Court asking the central government to update its nationally determined contributions. What are these? NDC means nationally determined contributions. That means every country that has signed the Paris Accord or the Paris Climate Deal, they have to update their nationally determined contributions every 5 years. This is one of the protocol under the United Nations Framework Convention, under the COP21 or Paris Climate Deal. So NDC hota kya? What is NDC? NDC means every country will tell everyone, the whole world, as to how much it is going to cut on its emissions first, okay? Because global warming is majorly caused by the emissions, okay? The anthropogenic global warming that we are talking about. Anthropogenic means that is caused by human activity. That is, anything that is caused by human activity is called anthropogenic, okay? Now, what is the news? Central government, in reply to the High Court's notification or High Court summon, has said that the NDC has been approved by the cabinet and they will be communicated to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Okay. Okay. Right. A bit of background. India is a signatory to the Paris Climate Agreement conducted through COP21. Actually, it came into force in November 2016, but it was negotiated in 2015. So what here is the concern, that India is also signatory to the Paris Climate Deal or Paris Climate Agreement, and under this agreement, every country has to update its NDC and tell everyone about its NDC, updated NDC, every 5 years. So the first was in 2015, India submitted its pledge. It actually submitted its pledge on 2nd of the October 2016. 2nd of the October 2016, that is the birthday of the birthday of Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, on that eve, India submitted its instrument of ratification to the to the Paris Climate Agreement. And okay, and in November 2016, this climate agreement came into force. Okay, the exercise was to be taken in 2020 or 21, you can say. There can be different things. Since someone can say the climate deal was agreed in 2015, but someone can argue that since it was that the India submitted its instrument of ratification on 2nd October 2016, so it should be in 2021. But still, India has crossed the time limit that it should have it should have bound by to submit its what we say NDCs to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Okay. What is Paris Agreement? The first and the most important thing about this agreement is that it is a legally binding international treaty on climate change. Okay. Now 1992, as I talked about in the very beginning, 1992 Rio Earth Summit led to the formation of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Under that convention, all the parties to that convention meet annually and decide future course of action. Okay. In the beginning, Kyoto Protocol was arrived at in 1995, I believe. Kyoto Protocol was a Kyoto Protocol for cutting the emissions of developed countries, basically. Okay. Kyoto Protocol talked about the emissions of developed countries. Why? Because most of the emissions were being caused by developed countries only. Okay. So Kyoto Protocol was, but it came into force, the Kyoto Protocol came into force in 2005, and still USA did not take part into the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol under the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was a protocol that demanded the developed countries to cut their emissions to a certain level. Okay. But Kyoto Protocol is kind of a failed system of governance. But still, it provided a lot of insights to the future generations as to how to negotiate a climate governance model. Okay. And then in 2015, when these countries met for COP21, they arrived at a very good model, I would say, for international climate governance. Okay. So the most important thing about climate governance is CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. Common but differentiated responsibilities means every country, wherever they stand, on whatever pedestal of development they stand, they have a common responsibility of tackling the climate change. But since they have a common challenge and a common responsibility, but every country cannot contribute equally. Okay, that is why every country should be provided with its own its own commitment models. Unlike the Kyoto Protocol itself imposed certain kind of emission cuts on the developed countries. But in Paris Agreement, that was done with. Okay, what the country said, see, most of the countries did not participate in Kyoto Protocol, like US did not participate in Kyoto Protocol. But in the COP21, these countries participated, and then of course USA withdrew from the COP21 and now it has rejoined the Paris Climate Deal. But what the point is that the COP21 or this Paris Climate Agreement, it talked about that every country should decide its own emission cuts. Okay, that should be decided by every country, because every country understands, it was a presumption that every country understands the need to tackle the climate change. But every country cannot be imposed upon a restriction, of course, right? So hence they should be allowed to make certain kind of emission cut goals for themselves, right? So it was adopted by 196 parties as COP21 in 2015 December and entered into force in November 2016. And India submitted on October 2nd, 2016. Right. The goal. What is the goal of this climate treaty? Okay. The goal is twofold. The first one is to limit the temperature rise to well below less than 2 degrees Celsius to the pre-industrial levels. Now pre-industrial levels we can assume 1700s for example. Okay. So what was the global temperature of that time? Whatever the temperature was, we have to restrict the temperature rise above 2 degree. Matlab we have to take action so that we have to restrict well below 2 degree. Now there's a kind of catch in the language of this agreement. It talks about well below 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue efforts to limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay, now 2 degrees Celsius, because 2 degrees Celsius rise can lead to catastrophic sea level rise. Okay, that is why 2 degrees Celsius is a very important parameter here. Now net zero emissions, the net zero emissions is one goal. The second point is we have to, at any cost, we have to not let the temperature rise beyond 2 degrees Celsius to the pre-industrial levels. And given that, we have to put a lot of effort to bring it down below 1.5 degrees Celsius. These are the two clauses. Okay. Now, that was the first point. That is the goal. Okay. That is the goal. Lekin, Paris Climate Agreement has three basic dimensions to it. The first one is limiting the global temperature. The second one is enhancing resilience and adaptation. That means adaptation and mitigation wala part. And the third one is align financial flows. Okay. Now, every country will have to submit its INDC intended nationally determined contributions. Intended nationally determined contributions are every country's voluntary emission cut targets that it imposes upon itself. Okay. Now, one important point is that this treaty is legally binding. That means that legally binding phrase is having this connotation. That means every country that is a party to Paris Climate Agreement is legally bound to update and its NDC nationally determined contribution every 5 years and communicate that NDC to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat. Understood? This is the legally binding part. Okay. But important point is, it is not legally binding upon every country to achieve that submitted NDC. Okay. This is very important. What the legal obligation means? The legal obligation means that one country must submit its instrument of its INDC targets, intended nationally determined contribution targets. Every country must submit to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, and it must update it every 5 years. But every country has submitted. Okay, but it is not legally binding on that country to achieve that target. Okay, so this is a kind of nudging, this is a kind of persuasion model for the countries to put some voluntary pressure upon themselves by putting such targets. Okay, and then trying to bring about a change, because every country will, it is a global ambitious plan. Okay, it is an ambitious plan. Every country should submit ambitious plans to cut the global emissions, cut their own domestic and global emissions, of course. But it is not, there can be certain circumstances, there can be certain situations where the countries cannot be able to achieve, and hence the obligation to achieve the target has been done away with. Okay. And this was not the same case with the Kyoto Protocol. In Kyoto Protocol, there was legally binding impositions on the countries to cut their emissions. Okay. Now the third and the most important point, and it has also been asked in the prelims question, that $100 billion per year in climate finance for developing countries by 2020 with a commitment to further finance in the future. Actually, there is a Green Climate Fund, okay, GCF, Green Climate Fund. Okay, Green Climate Fund was established in 1992 under the framework of Rio de Janeiro conference. Okay, and the World Bank was made the trust that should organize and that should operate that fund, and that fund would be used to that fund would be provided to the that fund would be used by the developing countries to tackle climate change, because green technology is costly. Okay, like India, for example, or developing countries, for example, rely a lot upon coal for its own energy needs. But coal is a dirty fuel. It causes what? A lot of carbon emissions, right? And to counter, but coal is also cheap. Hence, the cost of power production in India is cheaper as compared to the other countries which are using other modes of like green technology, right? So to help the developing countries shift to the green technology, this Green Climate Fund was created under the framework of Rio de Janeiro conference, and $100 billion a year was pledged by the developed countries to help the developing and least developed countries in their pursuit of meeting their INDC targets, right? Although it has not been able to live up to its expectations. Okay, now let's look at what is the mechanism under the Paris Agreement. See, okay, now 2000, it was negotiated in 2015, it came into force in 2016. A rule book was adopted under the Talanoa Dialogue. Talanoa Dialogue, under this it was one of the conference of parties that was held in 2018 in Talanoa, and in that conference all the countries agreed to a rule book as to what should be the basic rules by which the country should play. Then in that rule book it was agreed that every country will update its NDC every 5 years, and there will be a global stock take of the efforts taken by the countries every 3 years. Okay, and that was adopted under the Talanoa Dialogue. This is very important. Okay, and then 2020 was the year in which every country has had to update its NDC, and India had not done that. Then global stock take, like 2015 से 2018 में one global stock take. Okay, but 2018 में we arrived at a rule book itself. Then 2020 में new NDCs, and for after 3 years a global stock take in 2023, and then 2025 में communicate again new NDCs, फिर 2028 में. That means every 3 years global stock take. Global stock take means analysis of how much have we achieved on our targets. Okay, that is called global stock take. And net zero emissions by 2050. Net zero emissions by 2050. But net zero emissions by 2050 is not a goal for developing countries. It is for developed countries. Okay. Now, India's INDCs to reduce the emissions intensity. These were the INDCs that India agreed to in 2015. In 2015, when it agreed to the basically on when India submitted its instrument of ratification, it submitted this target. Okay, and by that India agreed to the convention. So the targets were, and now what has happened? The government has updated these targets, and that is why we are going through them also. It says that to reduce the emissions intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 from 2005 level. Okay. Whatever India was emitting at 2005, India will be reducing its intensity of emissions जो 2005 के लेवल पे था उसका 33 to 35% reduce करेंगे by 2030. Okay, it is very simple. Whatever emissions India were doing in 2005, we will be reducing at least 33 to 35% of these emissions by 2030. That was the first nationally determined contribution by India. The second was to achieve about 40% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel based energy resources by 2030. Okay, as we talked about, coal is a dirty fuel and it causes a lot of global warming. Okay, now again, with the help of transfer of technology and low cost international finance available under the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund, as we talked about, right? So, to achieve about 40% cumulative electric power, and we have overshot our target, we have overachieved it. Okay. To create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent through additional forest and tree cover by 2030. Now, this is reducing the emissions. This is creating more carbon sinks. Carbon sinks are forests and trees. Okay. So these carbon sinks, what carbon sinks do? Carbon sinks absorb carbon from atmosphere that is present in the atmosphere, okay, and trap it. So we will not only be reducing it, the emission of the carbon, but also trying to trap it. And we'll be creating an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion 3 billion tons of what? CO2 equivalent through additional forest and tree cover by 2030. So the targets that we submitted in INDC were meant for 2030. Now let's talk about some achievements. India's emission intensity. India reduced its emission intensity by 21% in 2020 itself. These are the achievements that were available in 2020. The latest achievements are not available, and that is why I have taken these. But it shows that India has reduced its emission intensity by 21% of the 2005 level, and that's a great achievement. Now UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, emissions gap report that was published in 2020 said that India's per capita emission is lower than 60% by the global average. Matlab, on average, if the global emission is, for example, 100 cubic tons of carbon per person, so India will be around 40 carbon cubic tons of carbon. That means India is lower by 60% to the global average. That shows India is already very low. India's emissions are already very low. India's solar capacity has grown from 2.6 gigawatt in 2015 to 36 gigawatt in 2020. Okay. India, along with the other solar enriched countries, also formed an alliance, International Solar Alliance, which is headquartered in Gurugram. Okay. Indian government reports state that India only country on its way to achieve its NDC by the NDC targets ahead of the 2030 deadline. Now, what are the renewed INDCs? Let's look at them. India now stands at committed to reducing the emissions intensity as a percentage of GDP by 45% from the 2005 level. Earlier it was 33 to 35%. Now the government of India has raised the targets from 33 to 35% to 45%. Okay. The country will also target about 50% of cumulative. Okay. Now 50%, earlier it was 40%. It has been raised by 10%. Okay. To further a healthy and sustainable lifestyle for environment as key for, that means the change in the lifestyle itself, that adopting such a lifestyle which is in sync with environment preservation and climate change. Okay, so we have to adopt such kind of a lifestyle that is going to help us counter or tackle the climate change. So these were the updated NDCs. I hope you understood what was the Paris Climate Deal, when it was negotiated, when it came in force, when India acceded to that. Okay, and I hope you understood the whole topic. If you have any doubts, you can reach me out in the comment section. Okay.